everyone. Thank you for the music entertainment, Ms. Gamal.
You're welcome, Mr. Chairman.
You got us all stimulated here for a good meeting. So I'd like to call the Winnebago County Board meeting to order. Tonight is Thursday, April 8th, 2021, if you can believe it or not, it is. And I would like to call on Mr. Billich this evening to do the invocation and pledge allegiance for all of us. Mr. Billich.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Please bow your heads. Lord, we know the darkness exists, that dark forces try to influence us, but you always bring us to your light and protect us. We thank you and ask for your continued love for us, and that you guide us with your hand to make the right decisions for our community. With that, I always ask for the protection for our first responders, the ones that put their lives on the line for us on a daily basis, and those that have served our country. We also ask that you bless and heal those affected by COVID and by this virus. We also ask that you actually, in particular, give energy to those that are administering vaccines and that are helping and aiding the offset of this horrible virus that has spread and plagued our people. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Our Father, sorry. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States
of
America,
to the
Republic
which stands
stands
nation,
one nation,
under God,
under
God,
indivisible, with
liberty and justice.
justice for all.
Apologize for almost going into the Our Father. The Catholic side got me.
Well, thank you, Mr. Billich. That was outstanding. All right, Mr. Thompson, is there any agenda announcements this evening?
No, Mr. Chairman.
All right, having no announcements on the agenda, we'll move on to our roll call. Clerk Gumow, can you please call the roll?
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We will start tonight with Mr. Kelly,
Here.
Mr. Lindmark,
Here.
Mr. McCarthy,
Here.
Mr. McDonald,
Here.
Mr. Neighbors,
Here.
Mrs. Red, Mrs. Red, Mr. Salgado,
Present.
Mr. Schultz,
Here.
Mr. Tassoni,
Present.
Mr. Webster,
Here.
Mr. Westcott,
Present.
Mr. Arena,
Here.
Mr. Billich,
Here.
Mr. Booker,
Here.
Mr. Butita,
Here.
Mrs. Crosby,
Here,
Ms. Fellers,
present.
Mr. Girl.
Present.
Mrs. Red is here.
Thank you, Mrs. Red. Mrs. Gorel,
Present.
Mr. Hoffman.
Present.
Thank you all. Mr. Chairman, that's 20 board members present.
Thank you, Clerk Gumow. We do have a quorum this evening, and we also have other guests on Zoom here this evening, so welcome to all the guests. We appreciate you being here. We'll move on to the awards, presentations, public hearings, and public participation part of our agenda. I don't believe we have any awards this evening. I don't believe we have any presentations. Do we have any public hearings this evening, Mr. Thompson?
No public hearings on the agenda, Mr. Chairman.
Very good. And I don't believe we have any public participation. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct, but as you mentioned, we do have several guests in attendance, but we did not have anyone sign up in advance to speak. I think we have guests here for possibly the proclamations.
Okay, very good. We'll go with that, Mr. Thompson. Thank you. So we do have two proclamations this evening. The first proclamation in recognition of Autism Awareness Month was brought forward by Board Member McCarthy on behalf of Lori Davey, the Program Manager for the Autism Program at Easter Seals. So if you want to sit back and enjoy, I will read this proclamation for everybody's attention here. So again, this proclamation is in recognition of the Autism Awareness Month. Whereas According to estimates from the CDC's Autism and Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network, approximately 1 in 54 children has been identified with autism spectrum disorder. Whereas autism spectrum disorder is reported to occur in all racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups, and boys are 4 times more likely to be identified with autism spectrum disorder than girls. Whereas because there is no medical test, diagnosing autism spectrum disorders can be difficult. A child's behavior and development are examined to determine if they are learning basic skills at the appropriate time. And whereas between 2009 and 2017, about 1 in 6 children in the United States has had a developmental disability ranging from mild disabilities such as speech and language impairments to serious developmental disabilities such as intellectual disabilities, cerebral palsy, and autism. And whereas autism spectrum disorder is treatable with personalized interventions and therapy, people with autism spectrum disorder can and do lead meaningful lives. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the County Board of the County of Winnebago, Illinois, does hereby proclaim the month of April 2021 to be Autism Awareness Month in Winnebago County, Illinois, and urge all citizens to support the families and organizations that help those with autism spectrum disorder to reach their full potential. So, Mr. McCarthy, would you like to say a few words on this, please?
Oh, sure, just briefly, and I just want to let everyone know, and some might not know this, but Easter Seals and part of Autism Awareness, they do have an office at U of I College of Medicine here in Rockford. So, of course, for further info, go to easterseals.com. But thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will present the proclamation. I'll pick it up at the office, and I will present it to Lori and her staff, probably the early part of next week. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the County Board to recognize April as Autism Awareness Month.
Thank you, Mr. McCarthy. So our second proclamation this evening is a proclamation in recognition of National Fair Housing Month. Whereas Winnebago County, Illinois finds that safe and affordable housing is part of the American dream and goal of Illinois residents. And whereas individuals in the state of Illinois have the right to choose where they live, purchase or rent property without discrimination based on race, color, religion, age, sex, familial status, marital status, national origin and ancestry, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, military status, unfavorable military discharge, and order of protection status. And whereas federal and state laws affirm the right of every person to equal housing opportunity, and whereas fair housing is a positive community good, and whereas economic stability, community health, and human relations in all communities in the state of Illinois are improved by diversity and integration. And whereas the talents of nonprofit organizations, housing service providers, financial institutions, elected officials, state agencies, and others must be combined to promote and preserve integration, fair housing, and equal opportunity. And whereas realtors locally and nationally pledge to provide equal professional service without regard to race, color, religion, sex, handicap, familial status, and national origin of any prospective client, customer, or of the residents of any community. And whereas realtors locally and nationally pledge to affirmatively pursue business practices that will ensure that everyone is welcome and no one is excluded. And whereas realtors locally and nationally pledge to affirmatively pursue business practices that will ensure that everyone is welcome and no one is excluded. And whereas realtors locally and nationally have incorporated affirmative fair housing practices into the Realtor Code of Ethics by which all realtors must abide. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the County Board of the County of Winnebago, Illinois, does hereby proclaim the month of April 2021 as National Fair Housing Month. In Winnebago County, Illinois, to establish our community as an open and inclusive community committed to fair housing, and to promote appropriate activities by private and public entities intended to provide or advocate for integration and equal housing opportunities for all residents and prospective residents of our county. So I believe Ms. Crosby brought this forward on behalf of Neely Erickson and other realtors in our community. Ms. Crosby, would you like to speak on behalf of this?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Realtor community firmly believes in the fair housing laws and policies. We believe in diversity, and we believe in protecting all of our protected classes in Illinois and, of course, within our county. So I thank the Rockford area realtors for putting the proclamation together. I thank the governmental affairs members that are here this evening to join us, and we greatly appreciate the support of the county. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Crosby, and thank you to the realtors and the great work they do for our community. All right, so we will get those proclamations out to everybody that needs them. Okay, that concludes our proclamations for this evening. We'll move on to our approval of minutes. Can I have a motion to approve the minutes of March 11th, 2021, and the layover of the March 25th, 2021 minutes?
So moved.
Fellers and Ms. Crosby seconds the motion. Clerk Gamow, can you please call the roll?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. We will start with Mr. Lindmark,
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors,
Yes.
Mrs. Red,
Yes.
Mr. Salgado,
Yes.
Mr. Schultz,
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster,
Yes.
Mr. Westcott,
Yes.
Mr. Arena,
Yes.
Mr. Billich,
Yes.
Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby,
Yes.
Ms. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Girl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel,
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly.
Yes.
Thank you all. Mr. Chairman, that is 20 board members, yes.
Thank you, Clerk Gamow. The minutes have been approved and also laid over. We move on to our consent agenda. May I have a motion to approve the consent agenda this evening? Got Ms. Crosby, second by
So move, Mr. Salgado.
Mr. Salgado. Thank you. Clerk Gamow, can you please call the roll?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. We will start with Mr. McCarthy. Mr. McCarthy,
Yes.
thank you. Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors,
Yes.
Mrs. Red,
Yes.
Mr. Salgado,
Yes.
Mr. Schultz,
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster, Mr. Webster.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Westcott,
Yes.
Mr. Arena,
Yes.
Mr. Billich,
Yes.
Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby,
Yes.
Ms. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Girl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel,
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
Mr. Lindmark.
Yes.
Thank you all. Mr. Chairman, that is 20 yes.
Thank you, Clerk Gamow. Consent agenda has been approved. We will move on to appointments, number 8. Per county board rules, the county board chairman appoints appointments require a 30-day layover unless there is a suspension of rule. We have 2 nominations this evening we will place up for consideration. The first is for the 911 Emergency Telephone System Board. Mr. Todd Stockberger is a reappointment. And the second is Mr. E.J. Delinardo. He is a new appointment to the 911 Emergency Telephone System Board. Information about both those gentlemen are in your packets. Please feel free to contact them for any questions or myself. So we will move on to number 9, reports of standing committees. First is the Finance Committee. We have Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Finance Committee has 5 items tonight. The first one is the ETSB budget adjustment, fire station alerting system. It's to be laid over, but I believe Mr. McDonald, on request, he'd like to motion. So I'd like to motion to suspend the rules and vote on this tonight.
Mr. Salgado motions to suspend. We have a second.
Second.
Mr. Girl is seconding the motion. Is there any discussion on that motion? Hearing none. Clerk Gumbau, can you call the roll, please?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman, and this is the vote to suspend the rules.
That's correct.
Thank you. We will start with Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors,
Yes.
Mrs. Red,
Yes.
Mr. Salgado,
Yes.
Mr. Schultz,
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster,
Yes.
Mr. Westcott,
Yes.
Mr. Arena,
Yes.
Mr. Billich,
Yes.
Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby,
Yes.
Ms. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Girl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel,
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
Mr. Lindmark,
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy.
Yes.
Thank you all. Mr. Chairman, that is 20 yes.
Thank you, Clerk Gumbau. The item has been suspended. Mr. Salgado.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'd move to approve the ETSB budget adjustment, fire station alerting system.
Thank you. We have a motion to approve by Mr. Salgado. Is there a second?
Second.
Mr. Hoffman is second. Any discussion on this item? Hearing
Believe
none. Yes, Mr. Salgado.
Mr. McDonald, is there anything? I know you had your hand up before.
Sure, if I may, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely.
I was going to speak to the suspending the rules, and the reason for that, ETSB funds are their own funds. Chief Bergstrom from Rockford Fire, the current ETSB president, as we all know, that he's moving out of his current position for greener pastures, maybe. But that was the reason why I was urging for its approval tonight, so we can get their funds in their hands. The station alerting isn't just for Rockford; it's available to all fire departments and fire protection districts in Winnebago County. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion? Hearing or seeing none. Clerk Gumbau, can you please call the roll?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman, we will start with Mr. Neighbors,
Yes.
Mrs. Red,
Yes.
Mr. Salgado,
Yes.
Mr. Schultz,
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster,
Yes.
Mr. Westcott,
Yes.
Mr. Arena,
Yes.
Mr. Billich,
Yes.
Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby,
Yes.
Ms. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Girl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel,
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
Mr. Lindmark,
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mr. McDonald.
Yes.
Thank you all. Mr. Chairman, that is 20 yes.
Thank you. The ETSB budget adjustment has been approved. Number 3, Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our next item is a resolution authorizing the settlement of the claim against the County of Winnebago entitled Kenneth Frickson versus Winnebago County, and this is in the amount of $325,000. So I so move.
Mr. Salgado moves to approve. Do we have a second?
Second, Crosby.
Ms. Crosby is second. Is there any discussion on the motion to approve? Hearing and seeing none. Clerk Gamal, can you please call the roll?
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We will start with Mrs. Red,
Yes.
Mr. Salgado,
Yes.
Mr. Schultz,
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster,
Yes.
Mr. Westcott,
Yes.
Mr. Arena,
Yes.
Mr. Billich,
Yes.
Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby,
Yes.
Ms. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Girl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel,
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
Mr. Lindmark,
I'll be abstaining.
Mr. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors.
Yes.
I need a clarification. I think from our training, when a board member abstains, does he need to list a reason?
Don't believe so unless he would like.
No.
When we did our training, I'm just making sure, can I get a legal?
No, I've never seen anyone list a reason for abstaining.
Okay, I was just going by the Ms. Sylvester training, but that's okay. So, Mr. Chairman, we have 19 board members, yes, 1 abstaining.
Thank you, Clerk Gamal. The resolution authorizing settlement claim against the county has been approved. Number 4, Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our next item is a resolution adopting the fiscal year 2022 budget policy, and I so move.
Motion by Mr. Salgado to approve. Do I have a second?
Second, Crosby.
Crosby and Mr. Neighbors second. Is there any discussion? Hearing and seeing none. Clerk Gamal, can you please call the roll?
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We will start with Mr. Salgado,
Yes.
Mr. Schultz,
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster,
Yes.
Mr. Westcott,
Yes.
Mr. Arena,
Yes.
Mr. Billich,
Yes.
Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby,
Yes.
Ms. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Girl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel,
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly,
Yes, and I believe our board rules only allow abstention in the case of a conflict of interest.
Mr. Lindmark,
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mr. McDonald,
No.
Mr. Neighbors,
Yes.
Mrs. Red.
Yes.
Thank you all, Mr. Chairman. That would be 19 yes and 1 no.
Thank you, Clerk Gamal. The resolution adopting the fiscal year 2022 budget policy has been approved. Mr. Salgado, item number 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The item number 5, the resolution for Senate Bill 1721. I'd like to lay this over for our next county board meeting. We've gotten some more information from Mr. Stadelman that they're making amendments to that Senate bill. So we would like to wait to see what those amendments are before we actually move in opposition or support of it.
Thank you, Mr. Salgado. The chair's, Mr. Salgado has laid that item over. All righty, number 6, Mr. Salgado.
Yes, our final item for tonight is a resolution In opposition to Senate Bill 2278, a proposed amendment to State Statute 55 ILCS 5-5-1006.5. And this is for the special county retail occupation tax, public safety, public facilities, mental health, substance abuse, or transportation. And I so move.
Is your motion to approve or in opposition?
In opposition for this, Mr.
So there's a motion in opposition by Mr. Salgado. Do I have a second?
Second.
Mr. Girls seconds. Is there any discussion?
Yes.
Yes. Ms. Gorel.
First of all, would you please explain what the last paragraph of the of this resolution? Could you explain to me the last paragraph and what it will encounter and who will be in charge of not only giving out the grants for this, but who will also oversee the money?
Thank you, Ms. Gorel. We'll have Attorney Vaughn.
At this point, we cannot say. Steve Stottleman represented that was placeholder language. So we're not sure at this moment if that will be the final language for the bill. So we don't know if it would fall under the Community Mental Health Act or if it will not. So that's why, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, then I suggest we lay it over until we find out what it actually means. When the taxpayer voted for this, they were under the understanding that that mental health, the Community Mental Health Board would have the control over the spending of this money and how it's handled. According to this, it sounds more like the county board is going to be in charge of how they use the money. And does that give the county board the privilege then of taking any of those funds and putting them into other accounts to keep our budget balanced? I want more information on this. Paul, what are you shaking your head for?
If I can interject, Mr. Salgado.
Yes, please.
So today we had a meeting with two of the mental health board members, Ms. Marianne Abadi and Mr. Kunert, and we asked the direct question about this particular bill. And they both said that they had a meeting yesterday with the mental health board, and it was agreed that they're in opposition to this amendment that has been brought forward, and they made that perfectly clear that they are in opposition to this amendment. So I just wanted the board to know that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I will also be in opposition to this.
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Yes, or Mr. Salgado, it's your committee.
Yeah, go ahead,
Yes.
Mr. Arena.
Thank you. It's just through our conversations about this, I think it was our intent that the county board would be following the state statute in terms of how this money is managed by the mental health board. But in our conversations with Ms. Vaughn, she pointed out that our resolution adopting the board wasn't specific to that fact. So we can, if there's a need, we can clarify that by an amendment to our code. A change of state law is not necessary to do that. And I would support that. It's my understanding that we were doing this so that our board acted in the same manner as what is referred to as a 708 board. Thank you.
Yeah, Ms. Fellers.
My comment toward this is that I believe that this vote is a bit premature and that the amendment and the bill itself are both still in committee and we don't know what they're going to look like when they come out. I believe that we've all made it clear and it's been made clear to Senator Stottleman what the board's wishes are. And I believe that we should give him a chance to modify it in committee prior to passing a resolution. I'd like to get clarification as well as to what Ms. Gorel was speaking of, as if there is a placeholder, it means it's still in the works. And I would like to, when we vote, if we are for something or against something, I think it should be in its final status, or its final form.
Yeah, just real quick, brief comment on that, Ms. Fellers. We had a discussion. It was kind of laid over. We had Mr. Stottlemyre come in, kind of explain the bills. We waited because we didn't know what committee it was assigned to, and we're like, well, if it's not in the committee, may not even make it to the committee. So once it made it through, we had the formal discussions in our last finance committee meeting. We had the opportunity to, one, motion for an opposition or in support. It came out of the finance committee in opposition to the Senate bill. That's why it's brought forward. We're following procedure here. If we want to lay it over or send it back to committee, we can certainly do that. That's up to, if there's a motion and a second, we can certainly do that. There is no one stopping from that. I'm just following through on that action that we have from our finance committee. I'll go first to Mr. Arena, and then I'll go back to Ms. Fellers.
Well, I'd like to ask Mr. Neighbors, as our representative on the Mental Health Board, during caucus the other night, he read some language that the Mental Health Board favored for this bill. Mr. Neighbors, is the Mental Health Board going to move forward with that language?
So that particular language was for the county board's resolution, not necessarily the state Senate bill. So that's some language that they want to change on the original resolution and not this particular bill.
I see. Okay. So I guess my comment or response to Ms. Fellers is I think that at the state level, this should have been negotiated with us before session. And this is something that we can just correct here in Winnebago County. A state law change is not necessary to do it. So for that reason, on this one, I think we should go ahead and move forward at this time and then just work with Mr. Neighbors to accommodate the Mental Health Board in our code. Thank you.
Ms. Fellers?
I actually don't know if this is the time that I would make the motion. Can someone clarify that for me? Okay, I would like to make a motion that we send this back to committee until the bill is in its final form. And we've had a chance to see if Mr. Stottlemyre will be adopting the advice of the Mental Health Board and the County Board. And also so that we have time to prepare a resolution with a language similar to what Mr. Neighbors has mentioned.
Is there a second? Second by Mr. Neighbors. So there is a motion, Mr. Chiarelli, there's a motion to send this back to committee. So then I guess, is there any discussion on this? All right, go ahead, Mr. Arena.
I just want to point out, if we send it back to committee, we're going to push it out 4 weeks and we'll miss the deadline in the Senate to actually take a position on it before it passes out of the Senate. So I would suggest that maybe the motion be amended to lay it over to our next meeting so that we can be in line with the Senate deadline. Thank you.
Ms. Fellers?
I'm open to that. I amend the motion to lay this over to the next meeting. And not only so that we can hit the deadline, but also it has to pass out of the House as well. So we do have a little bit of time. And I think that a layover for 1 week would be a good amount of time.
Mr. Neighbors, you good with that?
Yes.
Absolutely. All right. Is there any other discussion? All right, Mr. Chiarelli, I'll send it back to you so you can let Ms. Gamau.
Just one question for Ms. Vaughn. Do we have to remove the first motion and second to that was on the table?
The motion to approve, the original motion to approve?
Correct.
Yes.
So we would have to have Mr. Salgado, and I believe it was Mr. Huffman maybe, or?
Yeah, take it back.
Don't remember.
All right, Mr. Salgado, you remove your motion, original motion, and whoever.
And it was Mr. Girl that
Mr.
seconded.
Girl. Mr. Girl also removes.
Yes.
Okay, so Ms. Feller's motion to lay this over for 1 week to the next committee meeting, I believe. Is that
Next board
correct?
meeting.
2 weeks.
2 weeks to the next county board meeting. Very good. All right, is there any discussion on that item, that motion? Hearing none, Clerk Gummow, can you please call the roll?
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We will start with Mr. Schultz,
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster,
Yes.
Mr. Westcott,
Yes.
Mr. Arena, Mr. Arena,
Yes.
no time for drinking water, Mr. Arena. Mr. Billich, Mr. Billich drinking water?
Village had to step out.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Booker.
Yes.
Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby,
Yes.
Ms. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Girl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel,
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
Mr. Lindmark,
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors,
Yes.
Mrs. Red,
Yes.
Mr. Salgado.
Yes.
One more time for Mr. Billich. Okay.
Mr. Village had to step out and he would like Dorothy Red to take over for him in his absence tonight.
Okay, according to the roll call, I will list him as not voting and absent. So we have 19 yes and 1 absent and not voting. Thank you,
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The item has been laid over for 2 weeks. Mr. Salgado, does that finish your report for this evening?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that concludes our report.
Thank you, Mr. Salgado. We'll move on to the zoning committee, which is Mr. Webster.
Thank you. We have 4 items on our agenda this evening, all to be voted on. All of these, by the way, got approved by the Zoning Board of Appeals and by Zoning Committee. So they've already been read into the record. So number 1 is Z0121. That's a map amendment, and I would move to approve.
Mr. Webster motions to approve. Is there a second?
To Neighbors.
Mr. Neighbors seconds the motion. Is there any discussion? Hearing and seeing none. Clerk Gummow, can you please call the roll?
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We will start with Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster,
Yes.
Mr. Westcott,
Yes.
Mr. Arena,
Yes.
Mr. Billich. Mr. Billich is still out. Okay.
Still absent.
Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby,
Yes.
Ms. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Girl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel,
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
Mr. Lindmark,
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors,
Yes.
Mrs. Red,
Yes.
Mr. Salgado,
Yes.
Mr. Schultz.
Yes.
Thank you all. Mr. Chairman, that is 19 yes, 1 absent and not voting.
The item has been approved. Mr. Webster, item number 2.
Thank you. Number 2, 3, and 4 are variances. All of them are variances, so all of them came with conditions, as I read into the record. And so I would move, they're all from the same applicant, but I guess better vote on them separately. So I would move to approve V0121.
Okay, Mr. Webster motions to approve. Do I have a second?
Second.
Ms. Gorel seconds the motion. Is there any discussion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr. Schultz, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was the lone no vote on this. Staff
recommended against all three of these variances, and I believe that they had a strong rationale for recommending against approving these variances. And so that persuaded me, and that is why I'm a no vote on these three items. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, seeing.
Oh, wait a
none.
minute. Jean,
Ms. Crosby.
I would like to hear why they were opposed to it. Because I didn't get that rationale, so.
Thank you. Is Mr. Dornbush available or Mr. Webster? Did you know?
Sure, the reason that the staff was opposed to it there, I guess you might say, or the recommendation was for, because they're following, generally speaking, staff and ZBA paint by the numbers, and their recommendation was because they wanted this whole property actually what they wanted the darn thing, the whole property to be paved. And it just clearly wasn't practical. And if you read all the minutes on this, when they went back and forth so many times on this, and the applicant agreed that he would do the paving, but he couldn't do it all immediately. It's a very large area. And the discussion came up about permeability of paving an entire area or leaving part of it in green that absorbs some water, some runoff and so forth, made more sense than having a surface that is impervious, that doesn't allow for any of the water to absorb into the soil instead of just running off. And so there was quite a lot of discussion along that line there. And in the end, the ZBA was persuaded there that sometimes common sense prevails, I think, that's kind of what I got out of this, reading their statements. And
thank you, Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Ms. Crosby. Any further discussion?
Yeah, I just want the record to reflect that I believe that that is a part of what staff said, but I think that the board is at a significant disadvantage that Mr. Krupp is not on the call tonight to give a further explanation of staff's position, because it was not limited to that. And I would just encourage us in the future that when we're going to have zoning items, that we have Mr. Krupp available to respond from staff perspective.
He is
Thank
on,
you.
Chair, he is
Yeah.
online.
Okay,
Mr.
great.
Krupp is online.
Mr. Krupp.
Yeah, we evaluated the standards and we felt the standards were not being met. We specifically felt there was no hardship, so the hardship standard wasn't being met. And we also did not feel the intent or the unique standards were being met. We felt his site was not unlike any other site in the county. And for those reasons, we did not support this variance.
Thank you, Mr. Krupp. Was there any further discussion? Hearing or
Mr.
seeing?
Chairman, I have a question for
Yes,
Mr. Krupp.
Mr. Arena, you have the floor.
Thank you. Mr. Krupp, so when you say the hardship standard, what is that? Mr. Webster alluded to the fact that it was a very large area to pave and it would be difficult to do it all at one time. That issue isn't qualification of a hardship, the financial impact?
Like any other site, they would have to pave their parking lot prior to occupancy. So if the amount that's necessary to pave, they could do it in phases instead. They could do a lesser addition, which then would require less pavement. But since they want to do a greater than 40% increase in the primary building, it requires more pavement. So, like I said, all other businesses of this size would have to pave it prior to occupancy. I didn't feel his business was any different than any other business that would make this same expansion.
What is the impact of us
The option
making,
is to phase it rather than do the addition all at once.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
The option that's available to him is to phase the improvement. He could do a couple phases, which therefore would enable him to basically split the parking lot improvement into 1 or 2, 3 phases.
He could
There's
phase
nothing
the addition, you're saying?
I'm sorry.
He could phase the addition?
Absolutely.
Okay,
If he did a phase less than 40% of the original footprint, he would not even be required to put in the parking lot at this point. It's the fact that he went over the threshold of 40%, he's basically doubling the size of his building, is what's triggering the improvement. What he has out there is a grandfathered parking lot. It wasn't paved initially, and the code says if you go over the 40% threshold, then you need to bring it up to code. And that code includes putting landscaping and paving the parking lot. And what he's asking to do is waive basically those requirements, not to have to install the landscaping and not to ultimately have the parking lot in for up to 5 years. However, in his testimony, he said he would have the pavement in much sooner than the 5-year requirement. He just didn't want to have it put in prior to occupancy.
and that's unacceptable?
Well, staff was not supportive of the variances. We felt the pavement should be in at time of occupancy. However, the ZBA felt differently, as well as the zoning committee.
Okay, and is there any impact on, future petitions for variances by us allowing this now?
Well, our concern, there was nothing unique. There was no hardship. It wasn't unlike any other scenario, commercial development. So that's why we felt it should be put in upfront. If there's a unique reason, there shouldn't be a harm on other developments. But we felt since there was nothing unique, there was no hardship, it could potentially affect other developments because they may claim the same.
I see. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask a question?
Ms. Corll, you have the floor.
Mr. Krupp, how many acres do they want to pave over for a parking lot?
Their site is approximately 12 acres. They wish to utilize their entire site for displaying trailers and other equipment. So they're choosing to have a display lot of that size. And because they're choosing to have a display lot of that size, it will be just shy of 12 acres. But again, it's not being required by us that size. He's choosing to have it that large. So again, he could do a lesser display area and have less paving requirements.
Thank you, Ms. Corll. Is there any further questions?
Tassoni.
Mr. Tassoni, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, and I see it's out in District 1. I'd like to ask Mr. Booker, I believe he's out that way, whether or not he's pro or con for this item and how he sees it affecting or not affecting his district.
Mr. Booker?
Thank you. Yes, I haven't received any calls at all from the property owner on this matter at all. But development is a very fragile issue that I've got to deal with, and a lot of people are asking for some development, and I'll be in favor of it.
Thank you, Mr. Booker. Is there any further questions? Mr. Webster.
I guess I'd just like to add there.
Am I recognized?
Mr. Kelly, you have the floor, and then I'll go to Mr. Webster.
Oh, thank you, Chairman. My camera's not working tonight. I'll have to talk to IT. But Oh, one thing I'd like to point out is that paved parking lots create a lot more runoff for the ecosystem than do unpaved parking lots.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Mr. Webster, you have the floor.
Yeah, I'd just like to point out a couple of things. This is the reasons that I'd like to see people read the minutes of our meetings, because a lot of things were pointed out there, not the least of which is the business has been in business for, I don't know what it was exactly, over 20 years or whatever. Then what they're displaying is trailers that you haul your equipment on, anything from lawnmowers up to larger equipment than that, and farm equipment. And so typically we don't see those types of things displayed on paved surfaces. And it was brought out under testimony from the Zoning Board of Appeals, sworn testimony, that within just a few miles of there are other farm equipment dealerships and so forth. They don't have the paved surfaces in that either. And now some of them, of course, have been there for a long time, so they're kind of grandfathered in and all that. And so somewhere down the line, when it comes to that part there of paving things and paving 10 or 12 acres of these mobile things that are not there for a long time. It's not like having a parking lot down off of East State Street or something there where you have 400 or 500 cars parking in a parking lot every single day. And so this is on the west end of the county out there, very remote area, right on Highway 20. And there's not much else out there anywhere in very close proximity. And so, my feeling that I got out of that, listening to the testimony from Zoning Board of Appeals and so forth, is sometimes common sense prevails, or it should prevail. And so, and obviously sometimes the rules and regulations that we have in place, they can be, or we feel that they can be pretty hard and on some things that people want to do. So most times I find myself in agreement 100% with the staff and with the Zoning Board of Appeals. And this instance here, I found myself in agreement with what the Zoning Board of Appeals ferreted out from all the applicants and from there was no opponents actually, and from any other statements that were made there in support of what this business wants to do. And once again, they're not totally opposed to the paving of all this, but they would like to see it at a slower pace where they can have have 4 years to get it done, or 5 years to get the thing done. And the pavement that they're proposing there would be a little more advantageous to the environment and so forth if they used recycled asphalt, which does allow some drainage to run through it, as opposed to a hard asphalt surface or a concrete surface. And I guess that's about all I have to say. But once again, please, board members, read the minutes. I keep encouraging you to do that. Please do that. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question.
Mr. McCarthy, you have the floor.
All right, thank you. Mr. Webster, I hopefully you can be able to answer this. What is surrounding this property? Are there farms? I know you mentioned partially that there's nothing really out there except maybe other implement companies and so forth. Can you embellish on that a little bit?
It's out in the middle of ag country. It's farmland there everywhere. Just to the east of that piece, right on the very corner of Conger Road, there was a restaurant there. They closed down, and now there's I believe it's a used car lot there. And other than that, you have to go quite a ways in any direction to find any sort of business or housing, actually. So once again, it's not as though this were next to Walmart on Walton Avenue off
Right.
East State Street.
Right.
So that's what keeps rattling around through my head there.
So if I may make just a follow-up, according to our staff, he could pave up to 40%. So out of how much more percent does this company want to have paved? Because I think you did mention, or they did as well, that they want to eventually get it done over a period of time.
What the staff is saying, and I hope Troy follows up on this, but what the staff is saying about 40% is, according to our code, if they were only increasing the size of what they wanted to do by 40% or less, this issue wouldn't even be before us. But because of our new code that took place in 2015, I believe it was, now anything over 40% requires this whole process to take place.
So how much over the 40% do they want to do? Like another 10% or something paved is?
Oh, it's like way more than 60%. Troy, would you please straighten us out on that?
Yes, Mr. Troy.
Yes, it's 100% increase. So he's doubling the size of the building. So like Mr. Webster just explained, it's 60% over the 40% threshold.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Webster, for that explanation, Mr. Krupp. Mr. McCarthy, are you finished with your questions?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Is there any further questions?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, may I ask just one more?
Yes, Mr. Arena, you have the floor.
Okay, Mr. Krupp, just to make sure I understood correctly, our code would require them to pave 12 acres based on the size of the building?
Our code requires any area used for display or parking vehicles to be paved. They're choosing to pave the entire 12 acres. And because they have chosen to pave this entire 12 acres, then because they have chosen display and park over the entire 12 acres, that's what's forcing them to pave the entire thing. If they chose to only use 6 acres for display and parking, then they would only need to pave the 6 acres. But they're choosing to display and park over the entire 12 acres, so therefore the entire area needs to be paved now. So it's not so much the code is requiring them to pave, but the amount that's necessary is being determined by the applicant. He's choosing to do the entire site, to display and park on the entire site. So
Okay.
therefore, the surfacing applies to all.
I see. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Arena.
And I think, if I may, and I
Yes,
think,
Mr. Webster.
I'm sorry. And
Please.
I think that's where the hitch came on this, where board members, whether it was our committee or whether zoning board of appeals, that's where the common sense part came in. It was like, did it make sense to pave 12 acres, an impervious surface there? And so I think that's all I want to say about this, unless there's more questions. But I do want to also add this, is we are fortunate, Winnebago County is fortunate, and I'm saying this particularly to the new people. We are very fortunate to have someone in a position that Troy is in, that Troy holds this position now, that he is very knowledgeable. He doesn't have, a dog in the race either way. So he's going to follow the code for us every time. He knows the code inside and out. And you guys don't know how well I appreciate a guy, Troy, coming to us. And he's worked public and private, both sides of the spectrum he's worked on when it comes to zoning issues, okay? And so we have a guy like that coming, and once again, he doesn't have a dog in a race, a dog in a fight, whatever. And so he's gonna tell you everything about why we should or why we shouldn't, going by the book, painting by the number. And I want to add to this that prior to Troy coming to us, for several years, we had a revolving door for someone in his position. And tell you in 1 year alone, we had 3 different people because they couldn't cut the mustard. They didn't understand the job. And we were, back then, we got in trouble so many times with zoning because we got poor information from our zoning staff. We don't have that now. We have the information, but once again, we have the latitude. The board has the latitude, and the zoning board of appeals has the latitude to make decisions on their own. So,
Mr. Chairman, just a quick comment if I
Thank you,
may.
Mr. Webster. Mr. McCarthy.
Yes, I just want to thank Troy and also Mr. Webster, because it looks like they've done their due diligence on this project. So they're to be commended, and anyone else involved with this. So I just want to convey that.
Thank you, Mr. McCarthy. Any further discussion? Hearing and seeing none. Ms. Gummow, if you're still with us, you can please call the roll.
I'd love to, Mr. Chairman, and I'd love to start with Mr. Webster.
wow. Yes.
Mr. Westcott,
Yes.
Mr. Arena,
Yes.
Mr. Billich.
Not here.
Thank you. Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby. Mrs. Crosby,
Yes.
thank you. Ms. Fellers,
Yes.
thank you. Mr. Girl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel,
No.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
Mr. Lindmark,
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors,
Yes.
Mrs. Red,
Yes.
Mr. Salgado,
Yes.
Mr. Schultz,
No.
Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, that's 17 yes, 2 no, and 1 absent not voting.
Thank you, Clerk Gummow. The item has been approved. Move on to number 3, Mr. Webster.
Thank you. Moving right along. V0221 is a variance, same applicant. And I would move to approve.
Motion to approve by Mr. Webster. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Ms. Gorel. Is there any discussion? Hearing and seeing none. Clerk Gummow, can you please call the roll?
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We will start with Mr. Westcott,
Yes.
Mr. Arena,
Yes.
Mr. Billich, still absent, Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby,
Yes.
Ms. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Girl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel,
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
Mr. Lindmark,
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors,
Yes.
Mrs. Red,
Yes.
Mr. Salgado,
Yes.
Mr. Schultz,
No.
Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster.
Yes.
Thank you all. Mr. Chairman, that's 18 yes, 1 no, 1 absent and not voting.
Thank you, Clerk Gummow. The variation has been approved. Number 4, Mr. Webster.
Thank you. Moving right along. V0321 is a variance, same applicant, and I would move to approve that as well.
Mr. Webster motions to approve. Is there a second?
Booker, second.
Mr. Booker seconds the motion. Is there any discussion? Hearing and seeing none, Ms. Clerk Gummow, could you please call the roll?
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We will start with Mr. Arena,
Yes.
Mr. Billich. Still
Still
absent?
here.
Oh, he's still absent or here?
He's still absent.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby,
Yes.
Ms. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Girl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel,
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
Mr. Lindmark, okay, I'm seeing his head shake up. And
It wouldn't come off of mute. I don't know what was going on.
that was a yes, Mr. Lindmark. Mr. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors,
Yes.
Mrs. Red,
Yes.
Mr. Salgado,
Yes.
Mr. Schultz,
No.
Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster,
Yes.
Mr. Westcott.
Yes.
Thank you all. Mr. Chairman, that's 18 yes, 1 no, and 1 absent and not voting.
Thank you, Clerk Gumbel. The variance has been approved. Number 4, Mr. Webster.
Yeah, that's all we have. But as a follow-up, I once again, I do want to give a shout out. I want to give kudos to our staff. And Troy heads that staff. Since he came and since I've been involved so heavily in zoning over the years, predating Troy's arrival there, we had instances where the county got sued fairly routinely on zoning matters. And it's because we didn't have good guidance. We had people in that position that really didn't know what they were doing. And they ignored some things and they allowed some applicants to apply for things that they shouldn't even allow them to apply for. And so we went round and around. With Troy's arrival and with our former Assistant State's Attorney, Sarah Holy, we could turn to her and we've gotten good information and good feedback and some solid ideas about the way we should move ahead. And we had our 2030 plan came forward during this time as well, along with our Unified Development Ordinance. All these things have happened underneath our shared abilities here. And so I can't tell you what it's been like working with Troy and underneath Chris Dornbush as well there, you know. I can't tell you how fortunate we are in this county that we've stayed out of court on some huge matters for so many years. And that used to cost us a lot of money. And normally we lost every time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. I share your feelings as well as many others. Does that conclude your report, Mr. Webster?
Yes, it does. I think I talked plenty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. We'll move on to Economic Development Committee. I believe Ms. Red is stepping in.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The
Yes.
Economic Development Committee has no report this evening.
Thank you, Ms. Red. Appreciate that. Move on to Operation and Administrative Committee. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have no report this evening.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Public Works Committee, Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have no report tonight either. Our next scheduled meeting will be Tuesday, April 13th by way of Zoom.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Tassoni. Public Safety and Judiciary Committee, Mr. Girl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have one resolution that was laid over from the March 25th, 2021 meeting. And then as a resolution for approval of an intergovernmental agreement for South Beloit High School Resource Officer Program. And I so move.
Mr. Girl motions to approve the resolution. Do I have a second?
Second.
Lindmark and Ms. Gorel, seconds. Is there any discussion?
Mr. Chairman, if you will, I would like Deputy Chief Saganek to address the board and weigh in on some issues that were brought up Monday at our caucus. And if the deputy chief would like to, I would love him to weigh in on that, please.
Very good. Deputy Chief Zganek, you have the floor this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Girl. Before I speak, I had a conversation with Ms. Fellers. Ms. Fellers, would you like to speak before I speak, or did you want me to go ahead?
Thank you, Mr. Saganek. I think that you're going to be able to clarify for the board the same things that you clarified with for me. A lot of the issues that I had brought up were based on information, which was delivered to me by the county and by Mr. Rickards. And I believe that that information was accurate, but then a supplement from the Sheriff's Department did alleviate a lot of the concerns I had about the budgetary issues. And I'd like to then turn the floor over to Mr. Saganek. I just wanted to make sure that everyone knew that that the Sheriff's Department and all of our intergovernmental departments, Mr. Rickards, Mr. Thompson, et cetera, were very cooperative in making sure that the information was accurate and timely and that a decision could be made with appropriate accuracy.
Fellers, Mr. Saganek?
Thank you, Ms. Fellers. So there were some issues brought up about the pay for the Harlem SROs. The Harlem School District SROs, we have not sent the bill yet. The bill for the Harlem School SROs this year is $202,971. That includes the actual cost of the salaries at 75%. It includes the cost of pension costs, workers' comp insurance, unemployment insurance, and then at the end of the school year, there'll be a separate bill to the Harlem School District for the overtime for the officers that work on the school district. As far as the South Beloit School District, the South Beloit School District pays 10 months out of the 12-month salary, again, at actual cost. All the officers' actual costs are passed along to the school district. Now, that other time between the Harlem School District at 25% or those other 2 months, those officers are working for the county. They're doing county business. And just as an example, the school district, the teachers get 2 weeks off at Christmas break. We have those SROs back either on the street answering calls or at the front desk, but they're working doing county business. And so they're either being paid actual costs by the school district while they're working for the school district, or they're working for the county doing county business. There was a question also potentially brought up of, is the police department taking officers off the street to provide for SROs? By way of history with McChesney Park, we renegotiated the McChesney Park contract last year. And part of that was McChesney Park had 22 police officers, but they had 2 assigned to the Harlem School District. Well, when we were renegotiating, we were contracting with McChesney Park, and then McChesney Park was contracting those contracted officers to Harlem School District. So the decision was made when we were negotiating that we would just go directly with the Harlem School District for those 2 officers. So there's no officers off the street. When it comes to the South Beloit School District, maybe the board members will recall that after you approved the contract, we brought forward a budget amendment so that we could replace that officer and put an officer on the street. So there's no fewer officers on the street because of the school districts and the SRO contract. So hopefully that would resolve any of the questions that were brought up. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer those.
Thank you, Deputy Chief Saganek. Is there any questions?
Just a comment.
Yes, Ms. Gorel, you have the floor.
Yes, do these officers not have to go through special training to be there at the schools?
So that's a great question, Ms. Gorel. Thank you for asking that. The state of Illinois requires special training for school resource officers. It's a 40-hour class, and I don't have all the specifics right now of what that includes, but yes, they do. In fact, in order to be a school resource officer, you have to attend special training, and our officers have done that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any further questions? Ms. Fellers, you have the floor.
Yes, I have a question. I know that South Beloit High School has a significant Latino population, over 30% actually. Are there any language requirements or special training for cultural competence for the officers when they're going into these schools?
There isn't For the school district, I would tell you that that it's a priority for the sheriff that our officers get training like that. Just this past couple months, the sheriff worked with the YWCA to get a grant to ensure that not only all the deputies, but all the corrections officers, 911, that everybody works in sheriff's office, gets that training. So they've been through it, but it's not a requirement for the school district.
Thank you. Does that conclude your questions, Ms. Fellers? All right, thank you. Is there any other questions? Hearing and seeing none, Clerk Gummow, can you please call the roll?
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Billich, still absent. Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby,
Yes.
Ms. Fellers,
No.
Mr. Girl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel,
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
Mr. Lindmark,
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy,
Yes.
Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors,
No.
Mrs. Red,
No.
Mr. Salgado,
Yes.
Mr. Schultz,
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster,
Yes.
Mr. Westcott,
Yes.
Mr. Arena,
Yes.
Thank you all. Mr. Chairman, that's 16 yes, 3 no, and 1 absent and not voting.
Thank you, Clerk Gummow. The resolution has been approved. Move on to number 10 is unfinished business. Is there any unfinished business before the board?
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Yes, Mr. Sagadi, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. Just wanted to see if you have heard anything about the rescue plan, the American Rescue Plan on the $53 million of guidelines or anything on that, and see when we can have discussions regarding that.
Yes, thank you for asking, Mr. Salgado. We have not received anything formally from the Treasury Department at this time. I did speak with the Congressman Kinzinger by phone actually late yesterday, and they still have not put forth any guidance. I had the opportunity to talk to the governor yesterday, and I asked him that question. If they have heard anything on the state level, and they still have not received anything from the Treasury Department.
Perfect. Thank you.
We will let you know as soon as we do. Thank you. Any other unfinished business in front of the board?
Yes, Miss.
Yes, Mr. Westcott.
Yes. Are we going to continue going to the Zoom, or are we going to do the full county board, as many as possible anyhow in the next meeting?
Mr. Westcott, thank you. I will refer to Mr. Arena or Mr. Hoffman. I believe at the last joint caucus, there was discussion on that. Mr. Hoffman or Mr. Arena?
Well, from the feedback I've gotten so far from the Republicans, it seems there's agreement that we should meet in person for our board meetings as soon as everyone who wants to get vaccinated has been vaccinated. The committee meetings, there seems to be a lot of interest in maintaining the option of having Zoom. I think there maybe the Republican caucus would go for a blended type of approach where people who need to use Zoom while it's an option could still do so. But I had a conversation with Mr. Thompson and suggested that even after this is over, we still record those committee meetings so that they can be referenced by other board members to get educated on issues. And maybe Mr. Hoffman, I don't know what you've heard from the Democrats.
Yeah, I've not heard a big push from my caucus to go back live. Had a couple that, at least a couple people have stated that they're not quite ready to do that. So I don't know that we're certainly not 100% either way. So I think we're waiting just for more time to find out, like you said, if everybody's got their shots and if everybody feels comfortable. I don't think we've come to that conclusion yet.
Well, just to follow up, if anyone would object to us meeting in person for our next regular board meeting, could you contact your appropriate caucus chair and let us know, so that we can actually schedule a time to meet in person for a board meeting? If not the next one, then the one after that. Thank you.
Let me just add, if you can't get a hold of me, at least shoot me a text and either way, so I know that way for sure. That way I'll have a record of it too.
No, I have a question.
Ms.
Has,
Fowler,
has everyone who wants to be vaccinated been vaccinated? I believe there's a 2 to 3 week wait after the second shot before there's full, I don't remember, I'm not a medical professional and I don't know if it's 2 weeks or 3 weeks after the second shot before the vaccination is considered to be fully in effect. Is there anyone who hasn't yet gotten their second vaccination or their second dose? Mr. Girl?
I haven't gotten my first one yet, so.
Okay, so after you get your first one, there's a 3 week to 1 month wait and then a 2 weeks. So we're probably looking at least being 6 weeks to 2 months out from the entire board being vaccinated.
If I could, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Girl.
Thank you. I signed up about 3 weeks ago through the health department. So I will probably find a Walgreens or a CVS and go that route, or either go to the vet or a mass vaccination site next week. So I will be doing that next week, for the record.
There's
Hopefully.
a website for that.
There is a website, man. If there was just a website I could go to get an appointment, you know?
Thank you, Mr. Girl. Thank you, Ms. Fellers. Okay, is there any other unfinished business in front of the board this evening?
I have one more thing.
Mr. Westcott.
Yes, I have had both shots done over a month ago from the health department here in town, down by the courthouse. So I'm good and I'm ready to go. So I'm hoping that others will do the same thing. And let's move forward. This is a lot of trouble on this Zoom stuff. And a lot of us who have certain areas cannot continue to do this. I've lost so many times. My computer has gone out because of my internet service. So I'm looking forward to getting back into the realm of live broadcasting.
Thank you, Mr. Westcott. Ms. Fellers?
Oh, I'll defer to Mr. Lindmark. I see his hand up.
Thank you, Ms. Fellers.
Ms. Lindmark.
Mr. Chairman, we've been talking about this, and I'd like to propose meeting in person for the county board meetings and committee meetings, start doing them in Zoom. I don't know that there has to be a requirement. I mean, being vaccinated is a personal choice. As long as we're all remaining safe and going by the new guidelines, vaccination should factor into this. And I'd just like to get it off zero. I don't know if it's possible being new at all. If we could vote on this now, or we're going to keep this every week. Just a question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Lamarck. I know our county board room will be ready on the 23rd. The administration, we've talked about this, and like I said a couple of weeks ago, the city council has been doing hybrid meetings in person and on Zoom for their city council meetings for the past over a month now, with safeguards in place. So I've left it up to the two caucus chairs to decide how the county board would like to meet. But I'm amenable to whatever the county board would like me to do as the chair of the county board and conduct the meetings. Really, if up to the two caucus chairs and the caucuses. If there needs to be a vote, I believe the caucus chair should ask for that vote. Mr. Huffman.
Yes, Chairman, thank you. Back in the day, we'd always say, can we get a little bit of a straw poll? why don't we have everybody here now? Why don't we just ask the question?
Very good. Mr. Arena, are you okay with that?
Yeah, I'm fine with that. I guess the question would just, are you saying that if we are meeting in person for our board meeting, we could still have a Zoom option for anyone who's not vaccinated and doesn't feel comfortable meeting in a group?
That's correct.
Okay. Yeah, then let's go ahead and have it. I'd be okay with meeting in person for our next board meeting and then using Zoom for our committee meetings for right now.
Okay, so the question is, would you like to return to open meetings with the hybrid Zoom and in-person session starting on the 23rd of April 23rd? Is that an appropriate question for the caucus chairs?
It is for me.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, this is Brad Lundmark again. I want to apologize to the caucus chairs. I didn't realize that that's the way it was set up. I meant no disrespect to you. Thank you.
None taken, Mr. Lindmark. Okay, so we have the question before the county board.
I think Dave has a question.
Oh, yes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would ask if Dr. Martell could listen to my question/comment here. But I have read some lengthy paragraphs from the CDC lately. Myself, I've had both of my shots. Another week or so, I'm supposed to be as immune as I get. But in regards to vaccinated versus unvaccinated meeting in the same place, I've seen where if you're vaccinated, there's some things you don't have to quarantine, you don't have to wear a mask. And I'd just like the doctor's opinion on how can we respectfully and safely meet, whether it's all or some in an atmosphere like the boardroom, and just play it as safe as we can. Just your take on it, please.
Dr. Martell, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chairman. The recommendation, again, versus vaccinated or unvaccinated, I think, again, the goal is not, you really should not have to query someone, their status. Maintain the 6 feet social distancing and the use of face coverings when in a group. That would allow, again, the other part of social distancing for anyone who might be vulnerable, who might choose not to vaccinate for whatever reason. But so the challenge is maintaining the 6 feet. I understand the boardroom is being reconfigured to allow for that, as well as then face coverings when you're in the boardroom. When you're speaking, obviously, and you're vaccinated, you can remove them. The challenge that I hear, there's mixed messaging regarding if everyone was in a room, keeping the number of individuals small and intentional. If one was vaccinated, then you could move toward some degree of, either like we are in the schools, we're able to get a little bit closer in terms of position. But right now it's 6 feet, face covering, and vaccinated.
Thank you, Dr. Martell.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tassoni. Mr. Thompson, can you confirm that the boardroom would be ready by the 23rd of April?
Yes, it's the 22nd, but
22nd, I'm sorry.
Yeah, we'll have the sound system will be completed, but there really is not a plan to reconfigure the boardroom. I think it'll be the same configuration that it always has been. We would require masking, but there would be, I think we would be able to accomplish, the 3 feet social distancing, but probably not 6 between members.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Dr. Martell, did you have something further?
Yes, I would say that we would really want to take a look at how can we maximize the social distancing, whether it's staggering the seats. I heard the discussion of using the gallery area for seating of the board members and the 2 rooms that are normally used for committee to allow people to socially distance.
I would suggest, Dr. Martell, you always work well with the administration, so we can move forward with this. If the county board wants to take a straw poll on this, and if they want to move forward to the 22nd, we'll work together on this with Dr. Martell and the staff.
Absolutely. We want to.
Okay. So Everybody understands the question before you on a straw poll. It would be April 22nd to go back into a hybrid meeting situation in person or the offering of on Zoom. Clerk Gummow, do we need to take a roll, or it's hard to hear all 20 at one time, or who's saying no or yes? So I'll suggest taking a roll for this straw poll. Clerk Gummow, are you ready for that?
Certainly. And do you want to clarify what the question is?
Question is, are you amenable to go back into live session on April 22nd in the county boardroom with the opportunity to have Zoom available?
Thank you for clarifying.
Thank you.
We'll start with Mr. Booker,
In person, yes.
Mr. Butita,
You're muted.
Mr.
John.
Butita,
I'm sorry. I'm in favor of the hybrid meeting. I'll be there personally and for committees to continue on Zoom.
I'll take that as a yes for live
Yes.
meeting. Okay, Mrs.
Yes.
Crosby,
Yes.
thank you. Ms. Fellers,
I'm also open to the hybrid model with committees on Zoom.
Mr. Girl,
I'm a yes and ditto to what Ms. Feller said.
okay, Mrs. Gorel,
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
Mr. Lindmark,
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy,
Yes, in person and committee meetings by Zoom.
Mr. McDonald,
I look forward to voting present again, so I'm a yes.
Mr. Neighbors,
Yes.
Mrs. Red,
Yes.
Mr. Salgado,
Yes.
Mr. Schultz,
The hybrid board meetings and the Zoom committee. Thank you.
Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster,
Yes, I'm a team player. I'll go with the consensus.
Mr. Westcott,
Yes.
Mr. Arena,
Yes.
Mr. Billich is still absent. Okay, based on that, Mr. Chairman, we have 16 yes in person. We have 3 that are still interested in a hybrid, and we have 1 that's absent and not voting.
Thank you, Clerk Gummow. I believe we have the direction we need. We will work with Dr. Martell and our staff to accommodate this request. Thank you. We'll move on to, is there any other unfinished business?
Yes, Chairman.
Yes, Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if you have the answer to this or not, but if we're in a hybrid system, are we still required to do a roll call vote on every item, or could we get away from that?
I would defer to the state's attorney because that is a attorney general rule.
We'll find out and I will let you know.
Okay.
I know what the preferred way is, especially for Lori.
So I guess the answer is we'll get back to you, Mr. Tassoni.
We're going to be meeting in person, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, we'll take the roll call in person. Well, we'll work it out. We'll work it all out. All right, number 11 is new business. Is there any new business in front of the board?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Salgado.
Yes, thank you. I brought this up in caucus and I'm gonna request, whether it's through Mr. Thompson, to have Mr. Bill Crowley do an audit on the trustee program in regards to the compliance. There's been some information that funds have not been released to the different taxing bodies. As in that aspect of it, some of the county records as well have been kind of incomplete from our standpoint after review. I know that the regional plan came in and did a presentation, Mr. Setter themselves and Mr. Dunn, they did a presentation, but I'd like to see if Mr. Bill Crowley can get involved and do a compliance audit on the trustee program. So this is a recommendation, if Mr. Thompson can follow up, or if they need me to send out an email to Bill directly from the finance committee, I'm looking to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Salgado. I'm sure Mr. Thompson will speak to you about that, and Mr. Rickard.
You bet.
All right, thank you.
I have a comment on Mr. Salgado's recommendation.
Ms. Fellers, you have the floor.
Yes, Mr. Salgado, I'd respectfully like to request that any audit that we have Mr. Crowley do include the period prior to Region 1 taking over as well, because it's my understanding through talking to some people at the state and also at Region 1 that that any issues with this may have been something that they inherited. So I want to make sure that we're being fair and that we are looking at the entire program and not just recent transactions.
Absolutely. And whatever the means, my thing is the biggest concern from my perspective, and I brought this up, is, and I told Mr. Dunn, I think Mr. Shirelli, you were in the meeting as well. So I just want to make sure that we're on the same page. We're getting two separate from the treasurer's office, from the regional plan. What I want to do is I want to make sure that everybody's on the same page on this aspect of it. So if it requires doing an audit on Bellinger perspective, I know that there's pending litigation on that aspect of it. So I don't want to talk on that right now. But whatever means we need to do, it's been over a year now. I think the consensus is with our new agent, positive things have occurred with the sales and, you know, all that information. But at the same time, I've heard things that funds have not been released to the taxing bodies, which are very concerning to me. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. I'm getting different stories from the treasurer's office. I'm getting different things from the regional plan. So hopefully this audit for compliance, we can apply it both from prior to now, so we can move forward on this trustee program.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you, Mr. Salgado.
Ms. Fellers, thank you, Mr. Salgado.
Absolutely.
Okay, is there any other new business in front of the board? Hearing and seeing none, we'll move on to announcements and communications. Clerk Lori Gummow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The items listed below are received as correspondence. I'd also like to take this opportunity to inform the board we had a very successful election on Tuesday, and I would be remiss if I didn't say it is a complete team effort by Winnebago County. I want to do a shout out to the Sheriff's Department, the IT Department, Gus and his staff, the HR Department, the State's Attorney's Office. LAFA was there for the first time. We also involved the Highway Department, the Maintenance Department. It is truly a team effort on Winnebago County. Also, all of the election judges that endured the entire day for an 11% turnout, they need an extra special kudos. The wonderful staff in the Winnebago County Clerks and Elections Office, all the volunteers that worked to make sure that this was successful. And just a reminder that the results are unofficial. We have 2 weeks to count all the ballots that are going to be coming in. So we will not certify final results until April 20th. But again, thank you to everyone that voted, all the candidates that ran. Congratulations to the winners. They will be certified on April 20th. But again, thanks to Winnebago County. Again, we had a very successful election.
Thank you, Clerk Gummow. You did a fantastic job, and everyone involved. Very good. Open the floor for County Board member communications.
Mr. Webster.
Mr. Webster, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. This is kind of a follow-up to Lori's comments about the elections and so forth. We had an interesting thing happen here in my home township, which is Sherland, and my adjacent township, which is Harrison Township. Now they're both in my district. They're both very small townships. Curious thing that happened there was there wasn't any candidates for positions for trustees on either of these townships. There wasn't enough candidates, and there wasn't even a candidate for a road commissioner in Sherwood Township. So immediately I got some phone calls from constituents like, what are we gonna do now? I said, I have to find out. So I made some phone calls and I talked to the Board of Elections in Springfield. And according to the Board of Elections, from what I gathered, the sitting board members that are there now will have to appoint some people to fill out the rest or the next 2 years of trustees. So in other words, people didn't vote on it. So now the sitting board of trustees and the sitting township supervisors will have to come up with some names to appoint people for these next 2 years. So that's a very strange situation. I hadn't heard of it before, but according to the Board of Elections, it is not unheard of, that it has happened before in some remote townships and so forth. But to me, it's just kind of sad that you can't get enough people to do their civic duty and step up to the plate and say, okay, I'll do that. And so I think the voters are denied a choice in one respect, but it's their own damn fault for not standing up to the plate and taking charge themselves. Just my 2 cents worth.
May I make a suggestion?
Mrs. Gorel.
Jim, if I recall, did we not talk about combining some of the smaller townships so that we would have more people living in it, since most of that's farmland and they're spread out all over, and their children aren't coming back to their schools and their children aren't coming back to the villages that are in those townships? Do we need to reconsider combining some of those townships again?
This has been an ongoing discussion for many years about eliminating the township form of government altogether, and the county absorbs all of the responsibilities that a township does now. And so I'm sure that's a topic for another time, another conversation there. But yeah,
I would not eliminate townships. I would only, by population, combine some of them so that you don't run into this type of a situation.
Yeah, and I think they would have to agree to do that among themselves. But like I said, you're getting into legal matters that I have no idea.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Gorel. Any other board member correspondence?
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy.
Just real briefly, this past Saturday here in the village of Cherry Valley, on an upbeat note, is that we had a mobile Easter parade in the village. And with help from the various agencies, including recreation in the village, was able to put this together. We had a couple of police vehicles from the village, Park District. Mayor Clayson was there. Senator Severson stopped in. I was a participant, and it was a fabulous time. The weather was fantastic. People were just in really a wonderful mode. And we even had, of course, Mr. and Mrs. Easter Bunny that rode with us in one of our vintage vehicles that we had. So it was really a great and wonderful time meeting and being out in the community. For all the county board members, I tell you, that's the best place to be, is out and about in your community. So I just want to convey that to the county board. And Mr. Chairman, we do have a bag of Easter candy that I have to give to you. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McCarthy. I heard there was a county board member riding in a vehicle with bunny ears on. I
There
don't
you
know
go.
who it was. Very good. Any other board member correspondence? Ms. Fellers.
Just one more thing about the elections, and congratulations to Clerk Gumau on a successful election. I'm hearing from constituents that voting was easy and that they were appreciative of that. I wanted to give a shout out to the city of Rockford. Just last year, I was the only non-incumbent woman on a ballot for a non-federal office in the entire city. And this week, We elected women, we elected Black, we elected white, we elected Arab, we elected our first non-openly practicing, our first Muslim, our first person who doesn't openly practice Christianity. We elected our first openly LGBTQ candidate. I mean, really, it's extraordinary the amount of representation that happened just in one cycle, and I hope to continue that forward. As you know, I'm a big advocate for representation and for access. It only makes us better. So congratulations to the city of Rockford.
Thank you, Ms. Fillers. Any further board member correspondence? Okay, I just have a couple things. Earlier this week, our own Brian Erickson, who is the chairman of the Winnebago County Zoning Board of Appeals, father died. Mr. Eldon Erickson, our condolences to Mr. Erickson and his family. And also Mayor Mark Zula's father passed away, Michael P. Zula. He's the mayor of Roscoe. So our condolences go out to both of those gentlemen. In honor of Miss Gumow, who did a fantastic job, I had the opportunity to meet the governor yesterday or 2 days ago at the BMO Center with the big announcement that the Blackhawks is buying the Ice Hogs, and the state is providing about $12 million in renovations. If any board member can tell me whose birthday it was this week, they will receive this Blackhawk hat that I was given. So the first board member who can tell me who's elected officials, who's in the administration's building birthday will receive this hat.
Joe Shirelli.
Mayor Tom McNamara.
No. Who works in this building?
Oh.
Lori Gumow.
Lori Gumow it is.
That's right. That's
Who
right.
said that?
That's
Happy
right.
birthday.
Happy birthday to
Happy birthday,
Lori
Lori.
Gumow. And whoever said Lori Gumow wins the hat.
Mr. McCarthy will pick
Mr.
it up.
McCarthy.
I'm so sorry, Mr. McCarthy. This hat was too large for your head.
There you go.
Same thing.
You can come by and pick up the hat. All right, that's all I have, folks. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So move.
Second.
Hoffman and Mr. Neighbors and Mr. Salgado. I'm sure there's no discussion on that adjournment. So all in favor of the adjournment?